This is Dua Nakhala, the SANA coordinator. I would like to start by welcoming you all today and thank you for joining us on this exciting moment, celebrating and discussing a rather interesting and timely publication of SAS's SANA project, which stands for Security Assessment in North Africa. SANA is a multi-year project of the Small Arms Survey that began in 2012 following the Arab uprisings and the spread of armed conflicts and civil wars in North Africa. It aims to support actors engaged in building a more secure environment in North Africa and the interlinked neighboring regions. Among several other activities, the project produces timely evidence-based research and analyses on the availability and circulation of small arms and light weapons, the dynamics of armed groups, the trajectories of conflicts, and related insecurity, and hence the MANPADS report we're discussing here today. SANA is about to approach the end of its fourth iteration, which is due in August 2024, and we aspire for the project to be able to continue to deliver and contribute to knowledge. This report, the MANPADS report, is the fourth 2024 SANA publication. We have published a paper on extremist arms in Mali, one report and one briefing paper on Libya's armed groups in Zawiya and Abu Salim, and today the MANPADS report. The MANPADS report was published on our website a few minutes ago, if you'd like to have a look when you have time. As implied, the project started just after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya and the unraveling aftershocks of that fall, extending to regions and areas beyond the Libyan borders. These aftershocks took various formats, including but not limited to exportation of conflict dynamics, such as illicit proliferation of arms and light weapons. Today's report nicely falls under this category, yet it zooms in by examining the illicit proliferation of a subset of small arms and light weapons, i.e. MANPADS. This report studies the illicit proliferation of MANPADS in North Africa and the Middle East between 2015 and 2023, so it's pretty recent. In a few moments, we will hear from our esteemed MANPADS expert, Matt Schroeder. Matt is a senior researcher at the Small Arms Survey, where he studies the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Just WebEx is giving me some sort of updates, etc. Matt, I apologize for that. Matt is a senior researcher at the Small Arms Survey, where he studies the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons and strategies for mitigating the threat from illicit weapons. He previously served as a director of the Arms Sales Monitoring Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Matt is the author of dozens of other Small Arms Survey publications, including the Illicit Possession and Transfer of MANPADS, a Global Assessment, which provides an analysis of illicit MANPADS acquisition worldwide since 2011. You can find this publication and other publications by the author on our website. I am glad to announce that as of 12 p.m. today, 61 people were registered to this event. In fact, just before this meeting, we had 64, which implies the interest and the significance, the interest in and the significance of the topic. Matt will be presenting the main findings and the takeaways of the report, and this will take about 20 minutes. After that, we will be opening the floor for discussion, which may go on for more or less 45 minutes. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dua. And thanks to all of you for joining us today on this Friday morning or afternoon. Let me share my presentation. Can everybody see it okay? Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dua. And thanks again for joining us today. I know it's a very esoteric topic, or can be appear to be a very esoteric topic. but it's incredibly important. And I hope to explain why over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes. So what I thought I'd do today is provide a little background information on MANPADS and MANPADS threat. I'll then talk very briefly, I promise, about the methodology and the data sources that we use for the report. I'll provide kind of a top-line regional overview of illicit possession of MANPADS in the MENA region. And then I'll highlight some of our key findings. These are not all of the key findings. There are probably a dozen. So it's a very rich report. There's a lot of data, a lot of granularity. Can't get into all of that now. So I chose three that I thought would be that are either some of the more important findings that we had, or that I thought would be of interest to an online audience. And that includes continued proliferation of advanced MANPADS, despite a very robust international response in the 2000s. The increasing prevalence of illicit Chinese design MANPADS, and then Iran as a source of illicit MANPADS. So I'll start with a little background, including answering the question, what is a MANPADS? For any of those of you who are joining today or new to the topic. So MANPADS, or Man-Portable Air Defense Systems, are short-range surface-to-air missiles that are typically fired from a launch tube that rests on the operator's shoulder. Most are between 5 and 6 feet long. They're 30, 40 pounds, which makes them very easy to conceal and transport, both across borders and to attack sites. Most are what I call fire and forget missiles, meaning that once a missile leaves the launch tube, it doesn't require any input from the operator, which allows the operator to either reload quickly and launch another missile, or in the case of covert attacks, to escape, to elude capture. MANPADS are often categorized by generation, with first generation systems, which were first introduced in the late 1960s and generally in the early mid 1970s, and of which the most prominent, the most widely proliferated is the Strela 2M, Soviet designed Strela 2M, being much less capable than the more recently fielded third and fourth generation systems, which we refer to collectively as advanced MANPADS. So the images on the screen show the major components of the typical MANPADS, and then what the systems look like when assembled. So the grip stock is the launcher. The launcher is attached to the launch tube, which contains a missile. And then there's a thermal battery that attaches to the launch tube as well. In the case of first generation systems and some other systems. For more advanced systems, it's often the battery not only provides a charge, but also provides coolant that cools the seeker, which makes it more sensitive. When it's a dual purpose unit, it's often referred to as a battery coolant unit. So the threat posed by MANPADS, I think, is best illustrated by the photos in this slide. This is an event that occurred 20 years ago, but in terms of visuals and drama, I don't think it can be beat. This is the plane on the right, and in the upper left-hand corner is a DHL Airbus A300 that was hit by a first-generation Strela 2M MANPADS as it was departing from Baghdad International Airport in November 2003. As you can see, the missile hit the left wing, and it immediately knocked out the hydraulics for the plane, but it also ignited a fire. And you can see the plane on fire in the upper left-hand corner. The hydraulics knocked out, or the missile knocked out the hydraulics, which is a key part of controlling the aircraft. So right away, the crew was in danger, and they had to adjust very, very quickly to flying without hydraulics. But also the fire ignited started to compromise or threatened to compromise the integrity of the wing. And had that happened, had it burned a bit more and the wing had snapped off, that would have been it. It would have been lights out. As you can see, the plane landed successfully, but just barely. As they were starting to descend, one of the crew members gave themselves about a 20% chance of surviving. So in this case, there was a happy ending. Well, I don't know about happy, but not tragic ending But that's not always the case. In fact, according to the U.S. State Department, there have been dozens of successful MANPADS attacks on civilian aircraft, which have resulted in more than 1,000 crew and passenger deaths on these flights. So this isn't a theoretical threat. It is a very real threat with a relatively high body count already. Yet the nightmare scenario, the scenario that keeps some pilots up at night, I'm sure, and keeps all policymakers responsible for aviation security up at night, has not occurred, or at least has not occurred yet. And that nightmare scenario is multiple attacks, MANPADS attacks, either simultaneous or slightly staggered at major airports on different continents. An attack like this would bring civil aviation to a grinding, indefinite halt, with obvious implications for the global economy. This is the scenario that we seek to avoid, and that motivates the work of all of the individuals that are involved in countering this threat. So now let me turn very briefly to the methodology and data sources we used in our report. The primary data source was Small Arms Survey's database of illicit MANPADS, which is a global database with more than 400 unique reports of illicit possession, transfers, and use of MANPADS from 2011 to the present. The database includes reports on 237 incidents of illicit MANPADS activity in the MENA region from 2015 to 2023. So this is the primary data that we used, but it was also supplemented with information from a wide array of other sources, including key informant interviews. So just a bit more on the database and the entries are divided into two categories of cases. Category 1 cases are those for which imagery of illicit MANPADS is available from one or more quote unquote select sources. And by select sources, referring to government agencies, certain armed groups, UN panels of experts, and journalists and researchers physically located in the area where the illicit activity takes place. So basically category 1 cases are those from sources that presumably have access to the system, the illicit system, or the event, or are directly involved in the event, if it's an attack, or have access to people that have access. This isn't third-hand information picked up from websites. These are sources with first-hand knowledge of the incident under consideration. We also have a second category of cases, which we refer to as category 2 cases. And those are for those are cases in which we have imagery of illicit MANPADS or components. But the source is either unverified or is not a select source. And that includes a lot of the social media postings over the last 10 years that interesting, valuable, but a little less reliable, presumably reliable than the category 1 cases. I should clarify that just because cases are category 1 cases, it doesn't mean that we consider them to be confirmed. We purposely avoided the word confirmed because unless you're there, unless the individual, the analyst has access to the system in question, we can't confirm it. So we just have a little bit more confidence in the category 1 cases. But whenever possible, we corroborate the incident and the details about the incident with other sources. We do that whenever possible. And then we excluded entirely any reports that did not include imagery. It's impossible for us to even remotely be confident in claims, information about illicit MANPADS or launches of illicit MANPADS if there isn't any imagery. Too often, MANPADS are confused with other weapons. Too often, reports that don't include imagery are based on presumably uncorroborated, uncorroborable supposed leaks. It's just a category of sources that we just, it's too hard to work with. And so generally, we don't include them, and they're not included in our database. And then we also excluded those sources in which we know are responsible for misinformation. So if they have that reputation, if we know that they've done in the past, we don't trust it, we don't include it. So now we'll turn briefly to illicit proliferation of MANPADS kind of worldwide. And this is a map from the previous assessment that Dua mentioned that we published, I think it was in 2022. This shows illicit possession and transfers of MANPADS from 2000 and 2021. And there's color coding that roughly reflects category 1 and category 2 cases. But the main point is that a lot of this activity is centered around the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, nearly 75% of the cases that we identified worldwide concerned activity in this region. And this is in line with historical trends. The Middle East and North Africa has been a central focus of illicit MANPADS activity since the 70s. And that did not change in 2000 and 2021. And as we'll find out in a few minutes, it hasn't changed in the more recent time period that we studied. And here's a map of illicit possession transfers of advanced MANPADS. So advanced MANPADS meaning 3rd and 4th generation systems constructed or designed and fielded really since the 1980s, but up until present time. From 2011 to 2021, this puts this disparity in terms of geographic activity in much sharper contrast. As you can see, almost all of it is concentrated in the Middle East and North Africa. So now we'll just discuss some of the top line data and findings from our report. And basically, it confirms that the MENA region remains the primary global hotspot for illicit MANPADS worldwide. As I mentioned, there are 237 unique reports of illicit MANPADS activity that we identified, primarily possession and primarily by armed groups, in 13 of the 26 states that we categorized as MENA states. So half of the states in the region had some types of alleged reported illicit MANPADS activity. And this included a whopping 12 different models of illicit MANPADS, including 5 Chinese design systems, 1st generation 810-5, 3rd generation QW1 and QW18 pattern MANPADS, and then the Pakistani version, ANSA 2 of the QW1, and the FN6. I put the Mesach 1 and Mesach 2, I put a little asterisk there because of those are Iranian systems. The Iranians claim that they are an indigenously produced version of the QW1, QW18 pattern. But it's really, really hard to tell which, if any, were actually indigenously produced. In fact, there's evidence that many of these systems were not actually manufactured in Iran. They were assembled from Chinese components in Iran. But regardless, we can't say for certain that any of the systems that we looked at were produced in Iran because they're identical to their Chinese counterparts down to the suffixes and prefixes on the markings. So that explains the asterisk. One North Korean design system, HD16, hard to know which generation it is because there's not a whole lot known about it. And the rest were Soviet and Russian design systems, 1st generation Strela 2 and Strela 2Ms, 2nd generation Strela 3 and Igla 1, and then 3rd generation Igla and Igla S. No other region comes close to the number of reports of illicit MANPADS, the number of states affected, and the number of models that are circulating in that region. Middle East and North Africa is hands down the most affected region. So now I will turn to our first key finding, which is it's probably our most important and frankly our most depressing, which is that armed groups continue to have access to MANPADS, including advanced MANPADS, despite a robust, multifaceted international campaign to rein in their proliferation in the 2000s. So starting in the 1990s, earlier, but really in earnest in the 1990s, the United States government and then like-minded governments decided to take action against the MANPADS threat against civilian airliners. There have been numerous attacks, and the time they felt that with the end of the Cold War, the time was right to actually try to do something diplomatically about that. And so they launched an initiative to adopt a set of very robust export controls on MANPADS through the Wassenaar arrangement. And after quite a bit of diplomacy, they were able to achieve this goal, and they adopted the Wassenaar arrangement, adopted the first version of the elements for export controls of man-portable air defense systems. So that was the first kind of landmark moment for this campaign, which really kicked into gear after September 11th, and then even more importantly, a failed attempt by Al-Qaeda to shoot down an Israeli airliner in 2002 as it was departing from Mombasa, Kenya. That really kicked things into overdrive. So you had simultaneous efforts to both beef up the elements, make them stronger, but then also convince countries in other multilateral forums to adopt versions. And the governments involved were really successful, and they were successful in short order. Not only did the Wassenaar arrangement publish two increasingly strong iterations of the elements, but the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, the OSCE, and the Organization of American States all adopted their own versions. And so together, membership of these different organizations, over 100 countries, including the biggest producers and designers of MANPADS. Not legally binding, but politically binding, and really reflected a consensus amongst international leaders of the need for stricter controls on the export of MANPADS. And it included what really was a de facto ban on any transfers to armed groups, to non-state actors, without express permission of the host government. So that was a huge step forward, and that was pretty unprecedented for small arms and light weapons controls. But that wasn't it. So diplomacy is great. Norm building is great, very important. But that doesn't solve the problem. So they also undertook several practical measures aimed at reducing the MANPADS threat, including the destruction of surplus, obsolete, and illicit MANPADS, tens of thousands of them. These are the MANPADS deemed most likely to be diverted, and governments were able to get into some of these arsenals that were housing these MANPADS and convince the governments to destroy them. They also improved stockpile security practices at depots holding thousands more. So very practical, on the ground, immediate steps to mitigate the risk of diversion. They also conducted airport security assessments at airports around the world to make sure that security arrangements were sufficient to mitigate the threat of MANPADS attacks in the vicinity of the airport. Training, a lot of training for customs agents, for law enforcement officials. If they interdict an armed shipment, they better recognize the MANPADS that are there, because those are likely the most important items. And so there were a lot of efforts to do that. And then interestingly, and often not mentioned, is a less explicit effort to take down some of the most prolific armed traffickers of small arms and light weapons, including MANPADS. And the first big fish, or probably the biggest fish that they got, was Victor Boot, the notorious arms trafficker that was one of the examples used for the Nicolas Cage character in Lord of War. They got him in Thailand negotiating with a quote unquote member of a Colombian terrorist organization, is actually an undercover officer, offering to sell them Igla MANPADS. They staged several of these undercover operations and took down some of the biggest arms traffickers that had evaded justice for years. all under the pretense, well, probably many reasons for this, but one of the clear missions was to minimize the illicit transfers of MANPADS by these individuals. So really innovative, practical, and multifaceted approach to conventional weapons threat mitigation, one that we hope would be a model, kind of a paradigm that they could use for other conventional weapons. And probably, according to the most important metric, it was and continues to be a success. There haven't been any successful MANPADS attacks on civilian aircraft since 2007, which is really when this effort started to gear up. And that is the longest gap between successful attacks on civilian aircraft in the history of MANPADS. So it's hard to know exactly how much of that is ascribable to these actions, but without a doubt, these actions have contributed to the absence of attacks on civilian aircraft. However, this success is not unqualified in that the attack stops, but the proliferation hasn't. Armed groups still have access to MANPADS, including advanced MANPADS, especially in the MENA region. So we were able to identify 6 different models of advanced MANPADS in possession of armed groups in 9 of the 26 MENA states from 2015 to 2023. And importantly, at least 4 of these models, QW18 pattern, FN6, ONSA2, IGLA-S, had not been identified outside of government control, at least in publicly available sources, before 2011. So all of these new, very capable systems were introduced into the illicit sphere after states, over 100 states, has agreed to really crack down on illicit exports and diversion of MANPADS. And we're not just talking about one or 2 missiles here. It's not just outlier cases. We identified multiple models of advanced MANPADS in at least 7 MENA states, and multiple groups in possession of advanced MANPADS in at least 6 states. Here are a couple of examples. The photo in the upper left-hand corner is of Rapid Support Forces in Sudan shortly after the onset of that war, that civil conflict. And here they are displaying 4 third, 4th generation Chinese design FN6s, including one in which there's a gripstock and a battery, so a complete system. The upper right-hand corner is an image from a rally organized by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the military wing of the PIJ in Gaza, and they are displaying 1, 2, 3, 4 third-generation IGLA systems and 3 and 4 first-generation SA-7. So multiple MANPADS, including multiple advanced MANPADS, on display there. Lower left-hand corner is an image, a screenshot from a video released by Kataib Hezbollah, a violent armed group in Iraq in 2015. And that video shows multiple QW series MANPADS, including the 2 QW18 pattern MANPADS that are shown here. And finally, and probably most notably, I think, in terms of the number of systems on display, this is the picture in the lower right-hand corner is from an event organized by Hezbollah in Lebanon, one of the few events in which they actually showed their weapons. And it was pretty impressive for an armed group. Visible just in this one shot is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 QW18 pattern, Chinese design QW18 pattern MANPADS, a single QW1 pattern MANPADS. Those are all 3rd generation advanced MANPADS. And then 3 additional IGLA-1 pattern MANPADS. So not just a lot of proliferation, but a lot of access by some of the most prominent groups to multiple advanced MANPADS, which is very discouraging given all of the efforts that have gone into attempting to limit access to these very weapons. And this isn't even a complete accounting. The Houthis in Yemen have displayed multiple QW series MANPADS. Anti-Assad forces in Syria were able to fire dozens, literally dozens, of FN-6s from a state sponsor. And the Turkish authorities have seized multiple Igla pattern MANPADS components and MANPADS from Kurdish fighters over the course of the last 8 years. So widespread proliferation of multiple models of MANPADS. So on that happy note, we'll move to the second key finding, which is an increased prevalence of illicit Chinese design MANPADS in the MENA region. Until recently, Soviet and Russian MANPADS accounted for the vast majority of documented illicit MANPADS, and they still do for earlier generation systems. But that also included advanced MANPADS. So Igla MANPADS were by far the most common third generation systems available on the black market. While Chinese MANPADS, and especially advanced Chinese MANPADS, were rare. So, for example, a 2001 study that was published in Jane's Intelligence Review that looked at non-state actor acquisition of MANPADS from 1996 to 2001, they identified one case, one group that had acquired one model of Chinese MANPADS. The rest were Soviet, a smaller number of Western systems, including residual Stinger missiles from efforts to arm the Mujahideen, but only one Chinese system. A similar study completed by my colleagues in Small Arms Survey looked at illicit possession from 1998 to 2013, so a longer time period and a more recent time period. And they only identified 3 groups of 3 armed groups in Middle East, in the MENA region that had acquired MANPADS. So, and that was in 3 different countries. So an increase, but not a significant increase. That all changed in the time period covered by this report, by the report we just released. We identified 1 or more Chinese design systems in the arsenals of 14 different armed groups in 7 different MENA states. And this was over a much shorter period. So just 8.5 years versus 16 years for the earlier smaller survey study. So a huge increase in the number of groups that have acquired Chinese MANPADS, and especially advanced Chinese MANPADS. So this slide contains just a few examples of these systems. This is just a representative sample. It is not a complete list. These are, and I don't have time to go through all of them, but they're examples from Syria, from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Sudan, from Yemen, from Libya, all over the Middle East. And the proliferation of the FN-6 systems, which we hadn't seen until Syria, really just occurred so quickly over this time period. And the same thing with the QW series. The one in the lower left-hand corner, this is not one that we considered for our report because it appeared after the cutoff for data. But this is notable in that it's an FN-16, not an FN-6, but an FN-16. That was displayed, I think, used in Sudan. Supposedly, we still have to confirm it. That would be yet another Chinese design MANPADS that has entered the fray in some of the conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa. Again, we haven't confirmed this. It's just a single video, but another alarming development that illustrates how this is a problem that's evolving and kind of metastasizing in real. So, before continuing, I just want to make a point very clearly so that there's no misinterpretation, confusion. There is absolutely no evidence that any of these systems were acquired by armed groups directly from China, as in from Chinese manufacturers or exporters, or that the Chinese government had any knowledge of or involvement in the decision to supply them. This is diversion from importing states. It's either loss of control or diversion from importing states. We suspect that some of them were looted from arsenals, from overrun arsenals, but a lot of the others were willingly supplied by importing states. including, and one of the importing states that we suspect is one of the biggest culprits, at least in regards to a subset of Chinese design MANPADS, the QW series MANPADS, is Iran. And that is the final point that I'll be summarizing today. So the evidence linking Iran to many of these MANPADS is both direct and indirect. In some cases, UN investigators or government or government analysts were able to directly link Iran to the illicit MANPADS, such as these components for QW18 MANPADS that were found on the Jahan, which was a dhow that was interdicted off the coast of Yemen in 2013. So a pretty extensive investigation by UN investigators revealed, it included a review of evidence that the shipment was supplied by Iran. And this evidence includes interviews with the crew members, waypoint data retrieved from GPS devices found on the ship, and physical examinations, not only of the seized weapons, but also of the packaging. So based on this constellation of evidence, they concluded fairly definitively that Iran supplied this shipment, this interdicted shipment. And then other government agencies and NGOs came to similar conclusion. But that's a rarity. Most of the time, the data and evidence linking Iran to these shipments is more indirect. And here's an example. I think this is one of the more compelling examples that we were able to identify. The photo on the left is QW18 pattern grip stocks that were displayed by Hamas at a public event in 2018. The markings, what's key here are the markings on these grip stocks. And one of them is visible, the other isn't, but both of them have basically the same markings. It indicate that they were manufactured in 2005, lot number 19, and then one of them had a serial number of 2004, the other of 2005. So obviously from the same lot, especially given the sequential serial numbers. These markings were almost identical to the markings on at least one of the grip stocks found on the Jahan, which, as I noted previously, was directly linked to Iran. So same data manufacturer, same lot number, and then serial numbers that were just between 9 and 10 digits apart. This strongly suggests that these grip stocks have the same source. Is it possible that they were acquired from a different source? I guess so, but highly, highly unlikely, especially given the small number of sources of QW18 patents. These aren't Strela 2Ms. These are not widely proliferated systems or widely imported systems. These reside in the arsenals of only a few governments, Iran being one of the most popular. So that's one example of the evidence. Other evidence linking MANPADS to Iran include the fact that Iran is the only government known to be exporting both QW1 and QW18 systems, which, as I've mentioned, many of the groups that have these systems, they have both types of MANPADS. My review of open source data, I couldn't find a single other government that had imported both models. And also the fact that all four groups, the four most prominent groups that have acquired these models, and perhaps the only groups, I can't think of another one, are known recipients, documented recipients of Iranian weapons. So officials from Hamas have publicly acknowledged this and have even openly thanked Iran for its assistance. Other groups are less forthcoming, but there's no question that they receive a lot of legal support. And the Iranians are not subtle about this. And I think they're probably least subtle in the case of their arming of militants in Iraq in the 2000s. Seizures during that time period, seizures by US and Iraqi government officials revealed literally thousands of Iranian munitions, often from the same lot or year of manufacture, and many of which had rolled off production lines just a few months before they were seized. This continued for years. And so based on a review of this data, we concluded that there really is no way that senior Iranian leadership, Iranian decision makers in Iran, were not aware of and at least tacitly supporting the supply of these weapons. There were too many, the weapons were too uniform, and it occurred and it continued for too many years for this to be some type of low-level diversion. This was Iranian supply of weapons and Iranian supply of sensitive weapons and Iranian supply of large quantities of weapons over a sustained period. So based on this collection of evidence, we have concluded that Iran is almost certainly the source of a lot of these weapons, which is extremely problematic given Iran's pariah status and the fact that while it may not have manufactured these systems in the past completely on its own, it appears to be doing now. The more recent versions of Iranian MANPADS, the exterior of some of the components are still similar, but the key component, the missile, is very different from its predecessors. So this is a tough nut to crack, and it is a big problem, especially. So I am going to conclude there, and I will turn it back over to Dua, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. This is very interesting. We will open the floor for questions right now. And if possible, I'll try to group questions that are more or less about the same topic or relevant to each other. I'm going to ask the participants who would like to pose questions to write those questions in the chat to me, and I can read them out or sum them up before giving Matt the chance to respond. We already have one question. This question is about China, Iran, and the IRGC. Is their role necessarily one way? Is it imaginable they could play a reverse role, as in restoring MANPADS or withdrawing them?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not exactly clear. So that the IRGC may be restoring MANPADS for the Chinese government? I had not heard that. I guess in theory it's possible, but I don't know why the Chinese government would need them to refurbish their own MANPADS. I think this is more of a one-way thing. The Chinese government supplying the components and or the technology to Iran, and then Iran retransferring this technology to armed groups, almost certainly without the express permission of the Chinese government.
Okay, another question. Is there a dominant method of smuggling? Or is MANPADS smuggling?
That is a very good question. I don't think there is, but that's one of the harder research activities, is documenting the chain of custody of these systems, because the data is very obscure. The number of systems as compared to something like small arms and light weapons, in which there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, that move around the world illicitly every day. There's just not a lot of data. But I would suspect that there isn't one dominant form. Certainly there's not one. The number of sources is relatively limited, but the means in which they're trafficked, probably not one dominant form.
Okay, I got a clarification on the first question. So it's not restoring them mechanically, but can Iran or China play a role restoring MANPADS security, meaning control over weapons or taking them back?
Yes, I mean, I think that, so absolutely. I mean, Iran can stop providing them to armed groups. That That would be a huge step forward in terms of addressing this problem. And, you know, if they were so inclined, demanding that the armed groups to whom they have supplied weapons give them back. Is that going to happen? No. Chinese government, it's really hard to tell what they've done in response to this illicit activity on the part of the Iranians. Presumably they had more leverage earlier before the Iranians had improved their capacity to build their own systems. But obviously, whatever leverage they did exercise, it wasn't enough. Because the Iranian government has become more profligate, not less profligate in regards to the distribution of Chinese design MANPADS. But again, we don't. A lot of this stuff is done, you know, behind closed doors, and we have very little insight to what China did or did not do to try to discourage this activity.
Okay, next question. Do you have recommendations for avenues to prevent the diversion from importing states, especially in Africa?
Oh, absolutely. The elements for export controls of MANPADS includes a pretty detailed list of stockpile security measures that exporting states are supposed to ensure that importing states are implementing. It's not a complete list, but it's a good start. And then there are very, very detailed collections of stockpile security measures, accountability measures, record-keeping measures that other states have developed and that could serve to various degrees as models for other states in the Sahel. Some of the more high-tech stuff, such as digitized and networked inventories, may not work given infrastructural limits, but that's not really the most important activity anyway. It's really ensuring accountability in regards to who has access to MANPADS and MANPADS components. It's limiting the number of people. It's ensuring that people that do have access to these systems have some type of security clearance. They're more highly vetted than others, and storing key components separately. Don't store grip stocks, batteries, and launch tubes in the same room. That is a recipe for disaster. You store them in separate rooms. You adhere to international standards regarding the locks, the walls, the windows, the perimeter, the fencing. That's very important. But there's the political will to hold violators accountable. So you can have the most rigorous PSSM in the world, but if the governments that have these weapons conclude that the benefits of either selling them for a profit illegally or providing them to proxies outweighs any negative consequences, the PSSM efforts are not going to be fully effective and may not be effective at all. So it also requires that governments be held accountable for their actions in regards to these items. But that's just a few off the top of my head. There are many, many control measures, well formulated, well thought out, tried and true steps that states can take to minimize the risk of diversion.
I have three questions of relevance to the Sahel region and Africa. I will pose those three questions together. I think two of them actually are more or less the same. The first question is there a possibility that the proliferation will affect the Sahel? The second question, which I believe more or less is the same question, but posed in a different manner. Do groups in the Sahel benefit from the proliferation of MANPADS in North Africa? And the third question is there a diversion to groups such as Al-Shabaab in East Africa?
So I'll start with the question about Al-Shabaab. There was maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was diversion to Al-Shabaab and to its predecessor. I haven't seen any evidence of states actively supplying MANPADS to Al-Shabaab. more recently. The systems, we've seen very few examples of seized MANPADS, and the MANPADS that have been seized have been older generation systems that, probably been kicking around the region for years. So no evidence of that. Regarding the possibility that some of these weapons could be retransferred from North Africa to the Sahel, that's always a possibility. Anytime that a system is outside of government control, that system is vulnerable to diversion. Do I think that it's hard to tell what the chances of that are. The massive proliferation that we were afraid would happen as a result of the looting of Libya's depots really didn't happen. You had some cross-border retransfer, but it wasn't the disaster that we thought it would be. A lot of the diversion appears to be deliberate transfers by proxy governments. And then there's some diversion of those systems, such as the FN6 that was seized in Lebanon, across the border in Lebanon in 2016, and some that made it to Iraq. But generally speaking, we haven't seen the disasters associated with that type of inter-region retransfer, illicit retransfer that we feared in some of these cases. Could it happen? Sure. And it's important to point out that it doesn't have to be a large number. It could be one functional system or a few functional systems transferred to the wrong person at the wrong time. That's what makes these systems so dangerous. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I have another question. I actually have quite a few questions, but there is one that is also about diversion. So I will read this first because it's relevant to the previous questions. Are there ways in which diversion of MANPADS is distinct from diversion of other weapons? Is there a particular vulnerability, such as climate control, etc., in the chain of diversion on which efforts could be focused?
That's an interesting question. I think that touches on a very key point, which is, and this is why we were so optimistic in the 2000s when this Counter MANPADS initiative was launched. Controlling these weapons is much more realistic than trying to decisively reduce, significantly reduce the number of other types of illicit small arms and light weapons worldwide. The number of, infantry rifles, for example, is measured in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions. The number of MANPADS in the global inventory, the last estimate that I saw, which is now 20 years old, but probably isn't that different, it's 1 million that were made total, and perhaps 500,000 in global inventories total. So that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the number of infantry rifles that are circulating. Not only that, the number of authorized users, the number of and types of authorized users is very, very different. A lot of small arms are used by militaries, but also police and then civilians. So you have many, many points of potential diversion, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of points of potential diversion. With MANPADS, it's military depots. That's it. And it's not even all military depots. It's just military depots set aside specifically for MANPADS. So in theory, and then also the number of potential end users. The bank robber down the street has no use for QW18 pattern MANPADS except for maybe what he could sell for in the black market. So the number of potential end users is also much, much, much smaller. So in theory, they should be controlling them, including controlling the majority of them, is attainable. In practice, it's extremely difficult and getting more and more difficult as the geopolitical landscape changes and hostilities and a lack of cooperation continues between the Russians and the Chinese and the West.
Okay, another question. Could you expand on the roads and logistics My understanding is this is a question about illicit transfers.
Yeah, again, we don't have a lot of insight into that. The few cases of interdicted shipments, documented, publicly available, detailed data on interdicted shipments, and count on one hand, I think. So we don't have a lot of information on that, unfortunately. I wish we did, but it's just not available.
Okay. Are there any new contexts of MANPADS proliferation that have especially surprised you? Or conversely, any contexts where you may have anticipated proliferation that has not yet materialized?
Oh, that is a great question. That's a challenging question. I think, no, what surprised me is just how frequently armed groups and how widely armed groups are able to acquire advanced MANPADS, systems that governments should have, completely locked down and should be very, very hesitant to distribute, not only because it flies in the face of global norms, but also because their own airliners, their own citizens flying on airliners, they put them at risk every time that they supply these weapons to unauthorized and to armed groups, or that they fail to secure them. So back 15 years ago, I thought, okay, we're going to make serious headway. This is going to be a rarity. It's not a rarity. In fact, the number of cases and the sophistication of the MANPADS has just increased, especially over the last 5-6 years. Yeah, so that's what surprised me more than anything else. There was one case that, well, you know what? I don't know that I'm going to go into the granularity of additional cases that I find interesting because I'm a MANPADS nerd, but perhaps this person can follow up with me and I'll share additional information.
Sure. I don't have any questions anymore. Maybe we give the participants a couple of seconds. Another question. Okay, I got one more from the same person. Okay, just. Has there been any evidence on proliferation of MANPADS production or knowledge transfer from states to armed groups anywhere?
Yeah. So there's two different, I can think of two different cases. The first is we have less details about how it's done, but the effects are pretty obvious. Starting in Syria, early in the conflict, we started to see improvised batteries for Strela 2M pattern systems. The batteries were often viewed as the weak link for keeping MANPADS serviceable because they have a relatively limited charge. And once that charge is done, it's not like you can go buy some more at the local hardware store. So recognizing this limitation, some of the armed groups in Syria started to develop improvised batteries. And these batteries not only address the need for replacement batteries, but also made the system more functional. So whereas the factory-built batteries, they had a charge of maybe 60 seconds. You really had to zero in your target and move quickly in order to fire the system in time. The improvised batteries, some of them had unlimited charge. They could just scan the horizon for 30 minutes longer on end. And now we've started to see those improvised batteries elsewhere, in the most obvious cases in Gaza. So a lot of the systems displayed by the armed groups in Gaza include improvised batteries. So this is obviously catching on. The other case is the mercenary sale of knowledge of the use and maintenance of IGLA pattern MANPADS by Eastern European experts, trained Eastern European experts, to some of the combatants in Libya. And all of this was laid out in a court case in which this was, not the main focus, but it's fascinating. They identified the amount that they were paid. They were given bonuses if they were able to shoot down it, if the people they trained were able to shoot down the aircraft. And that's the first case, but it really highlighted the danger of intangible transfers. And intangible transfers are the transfers of skills, not hardware, but skills associated with the use of MANPADS. And so whoever asks that question, I'm happy to send the court documents associated with the case if they want to take a look.
Okay. Has the proliferation of MANPADS allowed more sophistication in armed drones and other UAS drones?
Has it allowed for more sophistication in armed drones? Sorry, I don't really understand the question. Yeah, so the more latest generation MANPADS are designed specifically to take out drones. Whereas the older systems, really, they were intended for larger aircraft. The newer systems, they are marketed as anti-drone technology. It's an expensive way to take out a drone, especially a $1,000 improvised drone. But apparently they do have the capacity, or they have the claim capacity for this. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I'm not sure how else the MANPADS would be linked to drones. So if you want to send a clarification, happy to try to answer it.
I guess the person who posed this question has heard you. That's Andrew Baker. So please feel free to send another follow-up question or clarification. Yes. Okay, he wrote something. The use of components such as seeker or high-capacity warheads.
Designed for MANPADS and used in drones. Not that I know of, but oftentimes I don't have access to that type of information. It's possible, and I haven't heard any cases. If I still haven't understood, perhaps Andrew, just send me an email and I'll answer as best I can. Oh, Dua, you're muted somehow for some reason.
Sorry, thank you. I don't have any questions anymore, but I have a question for you. It's more of a comment than a question. You mentioned proliferation continues, but use of MANPADS against aircrafts has not been a common thing. I'm kind of surprised, given the number of conflicts around. Do you have any guesses or explanations why?
I was waiting for that question. It's the $1 million question. It's so difficult to answer. I just say that use against military aircraft have continued, including successful use of military aircraft, especially against helicopters. There have been some very high profile, very devastating attacks on military aircraft. Why terrorists have not acquired these systems and camped out at major airports, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the barriers to doing so are not that high. Perhaps it's concerned. There have been some user errors that have resulted in failed attacks. So perhaps they've seen those examples and they're hesitant to conduct such a high stakes activity with a system that they can't train on because of the expense. And for which there is a history of failures, right? That may be part of it. For a lot of the groups that acquire them and acquire a large quantity of them, they have some political interest in not engaging in, or at least not in being selective in who they target, and targeting an airliner filled with nationals from many different countries. That is as surefire way I can think of having every single 3-letter agency in the world putting you in their crosshairs. So it could be that that type of attack is just viewed as too risky. I don't know, but this is all speculation. It's all speculation. We don't know. And but I would say just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen. And if it does, It will be devastating.
Okay, I think I still don't have any more questions. Last call. Maybe we give everybody a few seconds. And if not, I think we will end this event. Okay, so I think that's it for now. I mean, thanks a lot, Matt, for this interesting report and for this presentation and for taking the time to discuss with the participants. I would like to also thank the SAS staff for making this event happen, but particularly Dareen Atwa, SANA's project officer, as well as the comms and publications team, including Matt Johnson, Olivia Denonville, Lionel Kosernek, and Katie Lazaro. I'm terribly sorry if I butchered anybody's name. I would like to invite everyone to keep an eye on our several forthcoming publications, for which we also hope to organize similar outreach activities, at which we would love to see you all attend and participate. Just to give you an idea, we will have a paper on the Turkish foreign policy in Libya, another paper on a global violent data set, data update, and it will have a SANA focus. We will have a blog on emotions and violent extremism, a paper on violent extremism and proliferation of arms in Tunisia and Lebanon, and a paper on craft arms in Guinea. Last month also, we have published 2 papers on Libya's armed groups. One of those papers, those 2 papers cover Zawiya and Abu Salim. The Zawiya paper is being translated as we speak, and we hope to get it published online in a month or so. So basically, stay tuned. That said, please allow me to close this online event by thanking you for your attendance and participation. I would also like to invite you to stay in touch and share your future questions and ideas with us without hesitation. But also, if you have specific questions for Matt or any comments on the report, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Great questions. Really appreciate it.